The baking air distorted the distance, painting glistening pools in the shallows between the rolling dunes. Ironic, because the Vorsan was intent to drown anything that crossed it. Then Draco's eyes opened to the horror before him. It was an ingenious tactic to use their faulted senses against them. The mirages were a perfect blanket for an ambush. He could see it now. As the pieces fell into place, he lifted his voice. "Terracon!" Pitched voices were caught in perked ears, and confidence in Draco alone succeeded in conquering Terracon's instinct. Immediately, the captain pulled the reins away. Unexpected and averted, Ramses reared violently. The hooves abandoned prints were swallowed into the sand with a gasp, and the subsequent hollow spewed forth knobbed fingers and a calloused palm. A shaft of forearm stretched the hand into the air. The gravel coughed out the gnarled elbow, but choked on the shoulder, cutting off its reach just short of the sable unicorn's kicking hooves. The gaunt arm jerked back and flailed with all the lashing of a serpent's tongue. The joint seemed to be held together by veins and sinews alone, which rippled beneath the taut, leathery hide. It slapped the sand in search of its prey, but was slowly sipped back when it found only the arid, sun-baked dirt. Ramses dropped his hooves with a heavy thud and snorted with discontent as he retreated and waited for his rider's command. Confusion tripped Terracon's thoughts over one another. He wanted to be by the others, but was not sure what dangers were still swimming in the sand. His posture grew stiff, and his gasping for the desert's singed air grew quiet and calm. Uncertain, Terracon watched. The snatching hand had grabbed his attention, and it pulled on his curiosity as it slunk back into its burrow. His gaze stretched over the divot's rim to catch the narrow fingers, capped with their brittle nails, slip below the surface. Eloise loosened her arm's constriction from Terracon's waist and peered over his shoulder to see what had stayed their escape. The two watched as sand hissed shut over the sinking limb. The sides of the shallow bowl were scraped to settle the depth. The sand did not settle, however. The base of the hole sank, pulling the desert into itself. As the hole bore deeper, the walls began to break away faster. The circumference of the pit grew wider, and the sand under Ramses' hooves was slowly cut away. The unicorn retreated further. "Terracon?" Eloise muttered weakly, but the captain did not reply. "Terracon!" Terracon did not dare speak. He did not dare confirm what was happening. The tempo of his breath counted the moments that he wasted trying to figure out what he could do. The anxious rush was tightening his lungs again. Ramses took another step back. Eloise's grasp grew tight. He jerked the reins and steered sideways around the sinkhole before throwing his heels back and charging Ramses onward. The hand that sank into the desert's depths drew sheets of sand down with it, draining the dunes in a swirling vortex that gorged on whatever slid in. Terracon raced desperately against the encroaching edge. Sand snarled as they were kicked out from under Ramses' heavy trot. The curve of the crater's bank diverged from their heading. They were passing the sinkhole. Terracon perused the desolate panorama ahead. Heaps of glittering white sand were all that stood between them and the high ridge that obstructed the horizon and their eventual escape. The flickering, bounding shadows that had pursued them this whole way had finally faded. Sand exploded another reaching hand before them. Instinct tugged tightly on the reins and pulled Ramses out of the way. Terracon's eyes could not dart quickly enough to see where they would land. He identified the spot with only enough time to see sheets of sand break under Ramses' hoof. There was a moment between breaths that Terracon could do nothing but watch as the sand trickled around the hoof like the white foam of river water breaking on a jagged rock. He could feel Ramses slip, and every muscle in his body clenched, ready to tumble from the saddle. The swift pace at which Ramses was running had, however, left them with unaccounted momentum. The other hooves were still landing firmly. An extra step later, Ramses had pried himself from the sliding sand, and they could once again tear across the dunescape. The once pristine sands that rolled vacant across the wasteland, however, were now lapping with shadows. Dirty, unkempt nails scratched at and snagged strands of sunlight. Gnarled fingers bloomed from snatching hands, which blossomed on wiry wrists. The garden of dismembered limbs combed the gravel for anything to drag into the Vorsan's shifting floor. They sprouted more quickly than Terracon could anticipate, and terrified by their range and strength, his escape was repeatedly diverted back toward the sinkhole boring in behind him. Options were growing slim. The cascades of sand pouring down the funnel's slopes crept closer, herding them toward the hands aching to have them. There was neither the time nor space to turn around. Ramses wove between the greedy stalks. Only a few more evasions could be made before the hands walled them in. They were trapped in the psychological labyrinth of Terracon's fears. Any turn he might make might be their last. The boring sinkhole's creeping edge began to sweep back the sand around a wrist. There was now no way out behind them. They could only careen forward through the grasping gauntlet. Another hand broke the desert's crust. Terracon shifted course. Paths were drawn between the rows of hands. They had been chased into the last few turns. All of the routes were dead ends. The hands closed in. The sands before them tore open. Cracked fingernails scratched through the desert floor. Knobbed fingers pierced the gravel. Sand poured out of the cup of the palm like water from a fountain, sifted between the gnarled knuckles, and streamed past the muscular wrist ascending from the desert's depths. Terracon's cinnamon eyes fell to the dawning peril. Seeing the hand grow before him left his psyche molested. It had smeared the sweat of its rough palm against his chest as it reached in to cup his heart between its fingers and stroke the anxiety held within. The hands had fondled his fears, letting him shy away from their petting until he could find refuge nowhere except in their caress, where the constriction of their grip would crush his hope, and he could run no further. He was racing toward a moment when he would crash into his fears. He could not rear back any longer. There was nowhere else to turn. The hands almost had him. He braced for impact. Ramses lifted his black satin smooth hooves. The calloused fingers stretched toward them and brushed the feathering that swept in curls from the unicorn's ankles. His muscular thighs clenched and thrust a kick into the sand that leapt them in an arc over the curling phalanges. Vertigo swelled in their bellies as Ramses sank into the landing. The crash of his hooves against the sand left his ankles trembling through the first few trots. As the shock faded and his balance returned, Ramses quickened his pace. Moments passed with Terracon bent low over Ramses' shoulder, refusing to relinquish his gaze from the empty desert between them and the ridge. Fear had picked him clean of reason and emotions, leaving only the bare bones of instinct. He was inconsolable and determined to escape. They rode uninterrupted over a good distance before the still of the desert permeated his thoughts. When at last he realized that they were no longer in immediate danger, he turned to look back over his shoulder. Most of the flickering shadows had soaked back into the desert, with only a few arms still scattered on the surface. The funnel had slowed to a mere trickle, leaving a shallow, stagnant bowl with features no more outstanding than any other basin among the dunes. Seeing the calm sand shed some of the distress, yet Terracon still felt smothered by a lingering weight, as though the predator's hot breaths were still pouring down the back of his neck. Then he saw it. The dust of their getaway muddled most of the details, but Terracon could discern a stout figure standing at the edge of the basin. Sunlight shimmered on the copper armor, but it was too dull to make the light glint. Its long arms hung limply by its side. Around its head was wrapped a dark orange rag. Most striking, however, was the pitiful, lonely disappointment in its raw, glaring gawk. "Terracon!" Eloise screamed into his ear. "Give me your lance, now!" Terracon turned back, and immediately his mind tripped on the glaring, naked eyes toward which they were barreling. It had already reared its axe over its shoulder, and at this point no maneuver could give them the leeway they needed to avoid the blow. A sharp tug from Eloise slipped the leather-wrapped handle out of his hand and into her control. She had watched it crawl out from under the sands. Its slender arms and legs looked so human. The features of its face were so recognizable. It gawked at them with wide-open eyes, quite alive and conscious. To try and reason with it did not seem so profane a suggestion, and this left her gut heavy with guilt as she drew the lance back. It was a redcap. She knew that. A life of scurrying between shadows away from the blazing desert sun had desiccated its skin to a shriveled hide that crisped and flaked and was bleached to a sick yellow complexion. Its hunger had already sucked out the suppleness left between its tendons and now cast ravenous glances at them. Its head was swathed with a rag crusted in the dirtiest of reds, with clotted streams still streaked down its unwashed face and into the creases of the leather stretched across its bony cheeks. It posed an obvious threat. The blade of the antique hand axe that it flailed was more rust than iron, and the chances of its cracking were just as fair as of it cutting. Either way, they were certain to take the hit. They needed more room. There was no way to divert Ramses, and the lance was already too awkwardly long to be of much use. They were in range of the axe. The red cap lurched forward. The axe hacked toward them. Eloise could not counter its momentum. The concentration was not at her disposal. She was distracted by its proximity. It was too close. They needed more room. The desert's crust heaved on her command, and the currents she pitched underfoot hauled sands up from the depth to pour out between them and the red cap. The gravel swelled and crested until it could arch no more, then teetered and crumbled into a wave of sand. She would wash the red cap away. The tide tumbled forward, dragging the desert apart on a violent undertow. Rushing currents flooded its feet in sediment and gravel and beat against its skeletal knees. The churning foundation did little to distract the falling axe, however, and Eloise pleaded in the spare moment before the edge landed that the red cap would be driven back enough that the axe would fall short. The drifting sands were split by its narrow ankles and sifted between its wading toes. The splashing wave swept the sand out beneath its heels, and its footprints spilled back across the desert in a sheet of scattered sand. The surf tumbled off the tide's waning momentum, growing thinner until it soaked back into the desert. Her hopes crashed like the surf against a stone. Eloise stared in horror as the sands receded from the red cap, still firmly planted too close. Her supernatural attempt could not stir its footing, and the blade was striking. Eloise twisted her wrist as she thrust the lance, piloting the shaft into the path of the blade. The wood hacked and splintered as the rusted edge bit dangerously close to her hand. The weight of the blow ripped the handle from her grasp, and she used the last moment of control to force the point into the baked soil. The shaft quivered as it spiked the ground and stood erect, and Eloise let her grip slip away. The red cap lost its balance as it forcefully pried the axe head out of the lance. In that moment, Eloise recalled the tide of sand that she had swept away. The ebbing wave scattered the lance's foundation and whipped the weight of the pommel into the red cap's skull. A dark, wet stain saturated the already soiled bandana. Having overcome the immediate threat, Eloise turned her attention to Tarragon. She punched him hard in the back and forced a groan from deep within him. "What?" "Looking back," she snarled through gritted teeth and slammed her fist into his back again. "What are you thinking?" "Hey!" The tenor of his bark silenced both of them. She wove her arms securely around him once more, and they continued toward the ridge. The line of knights had broken in a feeble attempt to keep their mounts' hooves from being swallowed in the avalanche pouring out of their predecessor's path. Karen led the pursuit after Darrow, whom had already fallen beyond the apex of the ridge. Further down the slope, the other soldiers spurred their mounts away from their prince, stilled by anxiety. "Draco, come on!" Nesu snarled. Draco had slowed his unicorn near the foot of the ridge. Tarragon and Eloise were an anchor on his conscience, and it weighed on his pursuit of the others. He turned back toward Nesu. Over the vizier's shoulder he could see how far the others had climbed. He was needed by their side. He felt himself being quartered. The limbs of his psyche were drawn apart by devotion, fear, guilt, and instinct. Torn between his options, Draco could only stare, silent even to Nesu's pleading. Draco could not find his resolve, and was waiting for necessity to dictate his fate. At some point he knew something would break. It had to. If Tarragon fell now, then Draco could turn away. But not before. He had too much hope. Sunlight glinted off Darrell's polished bronze armor and distracted Draco from his survey of the captain's escape. The sergeant had turned back around and was now charging down the slope on a crumbling web of sand. His screams were inaudible through the distance, but their infectious qualities were made obvious when Karen began to wrestle frantically with her unicorn's reins to steer it around on the steep slope. Darrell rode past her, and a whisper of his wail began to soak through the distance. "Fall back!" Darrell screamed as his unicorn struggled to keep its footing while surfing down the slope. "Fall back!" "Fall back?" Draco contemplated. "We cannot fall back. To where are we to fall back?" "My lord, we shall have to fight," Nesu insisted. Ramu, Dion, Karen, Shem, Simon, Darrell, All the faces Draco had counted as they passed him had turned toward him once again. They swept down the dune and huddled around Draco, hungry for any morsel of a command that he might spare. Terracon and Eloise galloped in, and where once his attention was strained and tearing, he now felt crushed and claustrophobic under the pressure of expectation. Draco turned toward Daryl. The tremble in the sergeant's voice was soaking into every bone of their bodies. His account was stuttered and broken. "I saw them. They are coming." A random gasp, so plain that it could be attributed to none of them, sharply drew their attention to the vacant desert around them. "Daryl, from where are they coming?" Draco fished. "From..." Daryl's voice cracked between his panting, "everywhere." Their paranoid gazes raced through the desert panorama, but failed to catch the clues with enough time to react. The copper armor and jaundiced complexion camouflaged the guerrillas as they shifted around the dusty golden dunes. The dark orange stains of their blooded caps and the flickers of sunlight snagged on the jagged edges of their weapons betrayed their presence, but roaming eyes could only clip the flickering remnants of shadows of what nipped at their attention. "We have to get out of here now. We have to make a break for it." Draco's words were barely audible over the paranoia. "On my mark, run. Wait for it." Breastplates heaved with their heavy breaths. "Wait for it." Draco's purple irises darted around, trying to gauge any possible opportunity. Karen screamed. All of their opportunities were stolen. Draco wasted one moment to turn and see her, and another to follow her line of sight to the center of their defensive circle. The muddy orange rag swathed around the balding head was right at Draco's hip. Shem shouted his expletives and reared away. Draco could only hope to move as quickly, but first he would see its face. Its proximity terrified him stiff, and only when the redcap lifted its gawking eyes to penetrate him with their hunger could he make his escape. He threw his heels back and drove the unicorn across the plain of sand with a determination that blinded him to those in his command. His screams came too late. His orders were choked by his horror. Reimu's gaze was set in the distance, his back turned toward the uproar. The screams drew his attention over his shoulder, where his amber eyes caught more than a glimpse of their stalker. There were no trembles in his hands, only instinct to tighten his grip on his exotic swords. He dropped back in his saddle and swept one blade over his head and behind him. The redcap was nimble. It bowed beneath the slash, then lunged with its rusted halberd. Reimu parried, and a quick tilt in his wrist locked the weapons together. The shaft was unguarded, and a swift hack from Reimu's second sword rent off the rusted spearhead. Reimu thought he had bought a moment in decapitating the redcap's polearm, but there was no distraction. The redcap sprung. It threw itself at Reimu with such force that his stirrups could not keep him saddled. Reimu landed with a punch that cleared his lungs in one cough. There was an instant kindling in his empty chest, a starvation that could be satiated with one gasp provided his throat would open. But everything between his tongue and stomach was shut. Reimu was pinned, distracted and disabled. He could not comprehend how such a frail frame could be so heavy. He struggled against the snarling redcap, whose lips failed to curtain a smile of spindle-thin incisors. Someone called Reimu's name, but he was too busy tucking himself into his elbows to avoid the flurry of scratches and raking claws.